Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How you guys going? We're continuing on this small series talking about the key changes going from X-Wing 1st edition to X-Wing 2nd edition. So when we go to a game tournament to play 2nd edition, we know exactly what to expect. And today's video is going to be on turrets. Now, turrets were a thing in 1st edition that caused a lot of grievance in the X-Wing community, particularly amongst Imperial players, because A, Imperial players don't get a lot of turrets, and B, their ships don't fare very well against turrets. It was a concept that FFG had a very difficult time balancing in 1st edition. It started out with the very first wave with the Ion Cannon turret as an upgrade, and then in wave 2 we had primary attack turrets with the YT-1300, otherwise known as the Millennium Falcon. And from that point on we had weapons that could fire 360 degrees. Now there were things that came along that sort of went some ways to fixing that, some things that made turrets more powerful, but all in all the whole concept of being able to fire in any direction without any ramifications, no matter where your opponent's ship was, you didn't have to react to anything, did ultimately prove problematic. The one major tool that ships got to use against turret attacks was auto thrusters, which came about alongside the Scum faction in wave 6. And this was a very good, useful card. However, it seems like after this came out, FFG decided that this was too harsh on turrets, and in the very next wave, we had Twin Laser Turret, which is generally regarded a bit of a mistake, a bit too powerful for what it does. Even at 6 point, this card does way too much. And we'll talk a bit more about Twin Laser Turret in a second, but ultimately FFG shied away from giving ships just basic, better attacks as turrets, until early on when they got the Blast Turret, and FFG decided, hey, it's okay to have a regular attack turreted as long as you have to spend a resource, which was a focus token. And ultimately that wasn't too sought after, unfortunately. Later on this was somewhat remedied with the introduction of Dorsal Turret. Dorsal Turret, in my opinion, is one of the best designed turret cards ever made in X-Wing. And FFG kind of revisited later on the whole idea of Blast Turret, where you could shoot a decent 3 dice attack out of any direction as long as you spent some kind of a resource with the Sync Turret. And the Sync Turret needed a target lock, and the better thing with Sync Turret over your Blast Turret is a target lock as opposed to a focus token does not go away at the end of turn, so you're not really sort of spending a resource, if that makes any sense. You have to take the action at some point to get that target lock, but ultimately it's something that you can use turn after turn once you've done that. However, ultimately, what the meta has shown is, despite all of this, Twin Laser Turret really did reign supreme in terms of what turrets we want to pick. Even at 6 points, it's just not worth burning the slot on something else unless you really can't afford to spend your points elsewhere. There are plenty of lists that do use the Auto Blaster to great effect. Some even that I've seen that do like the Sync Turret, but this is usually due to points being very restrictive and lists really leaning into those kind of attack style that those turrets offer. Ultimately, Twin Laser Turret has just proven this very powerful and problematic upgrade, and there are two main reasons for that. First of all, its damage efficiency is just too good. There's no two ways about that. When you roll 2 attacks with 3 dice, even though you can only hit a maximum on once on each of those attacks, ultimately it has shown through consistent results that that is just too good. Also, the zone on the Twin Laser Turret is very impressive. Range 2 to 3 in a 360 degree arc is massive. Basically, if you look at the attack arc coming out of a ship, the further and further away, the larger that zone is. Range 1 to 2 is relatively small. If we incorporate range 2 and 3, it's a very large, wide attack zone. I hope I'm making this clear with my fingers. I might just look like an idiot, but I hope you guys can understand the whole idea of that. And ultimately, this led to Twin Laser Turret being a fantastic zoning tactic. At one stage during the 1st edition meta, the Syndicate Thug, the Thug Life list, with TLTs on Syndicate Thugs and Unhinged Astromechs proved really good. Unhinged Astromech on the Y-Wing 1st edition meant you could have 3 hard turns. They were originally red before you put the Unhinged Astromech on. And with those massive zones that deliver very consistent attack results, you can basically just box your opponent out. You just keep moving those Y-Wings around, trying to keep them behind your opponent's ship, do as much flanking as possible, and you can just out-damage your opponent. The consistent problem I've found with Twin Laser turret, especially when I'm fighting against it. You might be a bit oblivious when you're using it, but what I've discovered is when I'm using, say, a large ship with just a forward arc or even a forward and rear arc like a fire spray, the issue is once I get behind the ship with the Twin Lads turret, I need to spend multiple turns just to turn around. In the meantime, my opponent is just shelling my ship over and over again, and you just lose damage races because of that. This has shown up in many different builds, Captain Nim, Miranda, Ghost builds. It's kind of led to the power level of turrets getting out of hand, and everything else has sort of tried to catch up with it. Power creep got out of hand, and ultimately we are where we are in first edition. So having a nice reset, especially with turrets, is very, very important. And we will talk about primary turrets as well and just the general rules change. But before that, let's have a look at the upgrade cards. In particular, in second edition, we only have 2 turret upgrade cards: Dorsal Turret and Ion Cannon turrets. Now, first of all, it is worth pointing out that yes, they are much cheaper than they used to be. Dorsal Turret, relatively speaking, if we look at first edition to second edition, would be 6 points. Now only 4 points. Ion Cannon turrets is 10 points down to 6 points. And the main reason for this is quite simply because of this rules change. Now you must point your mobile firing arc in the quadrant that you want to fire your turret. And you need to spend an action to do that, and that's no small task. Because of that, when we look at a one-to-one comparison of the old turrets to the new turrets, they simply are not as powerful. Dorsal Turret in particular is basically a functional reprint. Now, I know it has a lot less text on it, but it fires 2 red dice at range 2, 3 red dice at range 1. It is exactly the same as the old one apart from that. The only difference is you must now manually move the arc. And another important thing to point out, because a lot of people seem to be missing this, ships that can fire with turrets but don't have a primary turret, they do not have the rotate arc symbol. And this led to a lot of people saying, oh, well, they mustn't have turrets anymore. The rotate arc symbol is on the turret cards themselves, and this is really good because there are plenty of ships that can take turrets, but you don't always want to give them turrets. So it's good not to have that on the pilot card itself, just to alleviate confusion. If you don't have that turret, you can't use that redundant action. It's a nice bit of cleaning up design there from FFG. And ultimately, what I was talking about before with the design of the basic turret that just does a solid attack, the blaster turret, the sync turret, the dorsal turret, I made the comment that I think the dorsal turret was the best designed. I still believe that to be so, and I'm glad to say that that is the one that made it through into second edition. And in terms of having a nice control option, Ion Cannon turret's a great thing to see coming through. It's not going to be as good against aces as it was in first edition. It was always a fantastic thing, particularly against ships like Poe Dameron and that kind of stuff. But remember, because it interacts as an action, your opponent can very easily arc dodge the quadrant that you select. So you generally want to try and favor this on ships with higher initiative, or you want to focus on zoning with your lower initiative ships. There's more of an imperative to use this correctly. You have to be smart about the way you set these up. It's not just a dumb thing that you plunk on the map and you go, okay, well, now if you fly anywhere in this massive zone, you just got to deal with it. And that's really good to see. I'm glad to see the FFG clean this up in a way that favors good flying. That's the key thing here. And this does indeed pass over to the primary turrets. Now, in second edition, every ship that had a regular primary turret attack from first edition has a dual primary turret in second edition, except for the Jump Master. And I think FFG are just being extra cautious with this ship. They definitely don't want it to be doing anything it did in first edition in any kind of too degenerative way. It does get its torpedoes back, so it's not completely dead in the water. But it is worth pointing out, yes, the Jump Master only has a single turret and its rotate action is red. Ouch. But the key thing I'm talking about here is about having to use that action in order to point your arc. And I think this is important to point out because in first edition, one of the most powerful turret attacks was on the YT-2400, particularly that on dash render. And in second edition, that's actually improved. The YT-2400 gets 4 red dice at range 2 to 3 and 3 red dice at range 1. Previously, it had no attack at range 1 if you equipped the heavily laser cannon, which is kind of what this is replicating now. The points that you invest in it definitely do reflect that. But remember, it does have to aim its turret, and that is a bit of a drawback. And more to the point, I think what's going to happen as we move forward with turrets is we're going to discover that any ways that we can employ to execute a bit of a better action economy, especially when it comes to the rotate turret action, is going to be absolute gold when it comes to turrets. Especially on ships that have higher initiative, because if you can react to where your opponents fly, even at initiative 5, and as good as the Y22400 is, it just doesn't have any out-of-the-box options to do that. What does have an out-of-the-box option to do that, and I think this is definitely worth keeping an eye on, and I've spoken about this pilot before, and I will continue to. I think this has had a serious upgrade, and is absolutely worth watching out for in the 2nd edition meta. Lando Calrissian on the YT1300, the Rebel edition anyway. And the reason for that is because on this card is a bit of a hidden mode. I want you to imagine that Lando didn't say the text that we see here on the card in front of us. Instead, he said, whenever you execute a green maneuver, you may perform a rotate turret action. That's pretty good, isn't it, if you think about it? He interacts at initiative 5. Again, that's going to be after a lot of ships that your opponent flies. Going to be great against swarms. It's going to even be decent against a lot of aces, Inquisitors, Guri, Luke Skywalker, all these other initiative 5 ships. Suddenly, Lando has a great way to react to their arc dodging. Now, let's expand that a little bit. Let's say that Lando says, whenever you do a green maneuver, you may execute a rotate turret action, or any other action on his action bar. Great. Flexibility. No complaints there. You could say use his rotate turret action as a default, but you always have the option of doing anything else if you want to, if the turret's already pointing in the right direction, or if you really, really need to make sure you have an evade or a focus or whatever, if you need to be defensive or a target locks up the next turn, you have even more flexibility. But Lando is even better than that. In fact, we get to the version of the card we're looking at right here. Imagine that he says, whenever you do a green action, you may rotate your turret, you may do any other action on his bar, or any other ship touching him or at range 1 can take an action. The fact of the matter is, the base level thing that Lando can do is rotate his turret every time he does a green maneuver. And that alone is fantastic, but the flexibility out of this card is excellent. The reason I want to bring up rotate turret as a kind of default way of thinking about the way we interact with Lando is because action economy with turrets is going to be so powerful. It's going to be even more relevant and higher initiative, which is exactly what he is. And I know I'm spending a lot of this video talking about Lando, but this is the key thing I think we have to watch out for turrets. Indeed, there is one other card I want to mention as well, and that's Agile Gunner. This is the card that we got the details for just out of Gen Con. This was spoiled previously, but we finally got a nice image of this after Gen Con because there were some images of those in the cabinets there. And Agile Gunner basically does what Gyroscopic Targeting did in 1st edition. And I hope I don't sound too pompous here, but I really feel like I am very qualified to talk about this topic in particular because I know the Shadowcaster. I flew it religiously for about 1.5 years now, ever since it came out. It's a fantastic ship, and it's the design that really took off, and FFG said, hey, that's a really cool design for turrets. From now on, every other turreted ship has this design. It's the original ship that had the mobile arc indicator, and you have to aim it into quadrants. That's how turrets work. It's how turrets work from now on. And Gyroscopic Targeting was a very interesting card because apart from anything else, it lets you rotate your turret arc during the end phase. And I think this is a really powerful effect, and I'm very happy to see it on Agile Gunner. I'm a bit sad that it doesn't actually go on the Shadowcast, but let's not talk about that. And what this does is give you that same effect at a bit more of an investment. I will say I don't feel like this is overcosted in any way. Even going all the way up to 10 points, the fact that you can put this on any ship and you don't need to do any particular speed maneuver is very, very good. Now, yeah, in the case of the Shadowcaster, doing 3, 4, and 5 speeds was never a difficult task. But nevertheless, it did occasionally come up. Sometimes you just wanted to do a 1 forward and move the arc, but you couldn't very occasionally. But what this effect offers us is action economy. At the expense of information to your opponent. I know a lot of people don't like gyroscopic targeting because it does telegraph things, but the cool thing is it gives you that action economy, and sometimes telegraphing to your opponent isn't always the most terrible thing. You can psych them out by making them double guess at what you're about to do, and plus if you're using zoning tactics where you basically go, okay, this big wedge of the map here is just going to get shot if you fly into it too bad. Zoning is essentially the opposite of arc duck dodging. I hope I've made that clear. Basically, it's the idea that you can open up a large enough section of the map to aim at and force aces to either use their actions to get out of it or just cop an attack. Ideally, the best way to deal with aces with low initiative ships is to do that, is to force them into bad situations. An Agile Gunner, just like Gyroscopic Targeting, is going to be a great tool to do that moving into 2nd edition. And just like Lando Calrissian, Agile Gunner, and other cards like it, I think this is going to be a key power level thing moving forward, making sure that with your turrets, you have a solid action economy. This is going to be a key thing with building out turrets. And yes, we have really cool things like Veteran Turret Gunner, Han Solo, Bistan, all of these kinds of gunners that give you extra attacks. But I do just want to caution you guys, don't be too excited by this extra spiky gameplay. If you can't get the attacks working in the first place, this is not necessarily going to power you out wins. You have to make sure that getting your attacks in the first place is a very high priority. And that's just my 2 cents on the matter. Just be very cautious with turrets moving in 2nd edition. Don't just plonk them on the table and expect them to be as powerful as they were in 1st edition. They aren't necessarily going to zone as well as they did in 1st edition, but they can with the right flying, with the right level of planning, and be very consciously aware of how they interact with initiative. You can't just get a whole heap of PS1s like you did in 1st edition. The higher initiative you have, the better and more effective your turrets are going to be. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I have one more of these design changes videos to come out in the next couple of days just before 2nd edition comes out. In the meantime, like and subscribe. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Reddit, and I'll catch you guys later on.